For 3.5 years, the sky above Israel remained a brassy, unyielding dome. It was a suffocating expanse that offered no mercy and no shade. Below, the earth had forgotten the touch of rain. The soil split into jagged, thirsty veins, and the once mighty rivers retreated into nothing but cracked, gray mud. Every horizon shimmered with the heat of a furnace. There was no dew in the morning, no relief when the sun descended, only the relentless weight of a stagnant, dry atmosphere. The vegetation had long since surrendered, turning into brittle, colorless skeletons that crumbled at the slightest contact with the wind. A heavy, unnatural silence settled over the land, broken only by the sound of dust shifting across the barren plains. It was a landscape stripped of its pulse, where the very air felt thin and exhausted. The cycle of seasons had stopped, replaced by a singular, crushing reality of absolute depletion. Nothing moved that did not have to, and everything that remained bore the scars of a long, slow starvation. The ground was hardened by the sun, waiting for a change that felt impossible. The livestock were the first to signal the end. In the fields, cattle staggered under the weight of their own bones, their ribs pressing hard against dry, leathery skin. They collapsed in the dust, legs folding slowly, eyes clouding over as the heat drained their final reserves of strength. There were no lowing sounds, no movement, only the stillness of bodies sinking into the parched ground. The grain fields, once a sea of gold, had withered into brittle, gray straw that snapped with a sharp, hollow sound beneath a boot. Farmers walked through these remains, clutching handfuls of dust where kernels should have been. The wells were hollow pits, echoing with the sound of wind. Every village had fallen into a heavy, suffocating quiet. Parents watched their children grow hollow-cheeked, the lack of water carving lines of premature age into their faces. The hope of a seasonal turn had evaporated months ago, replaced by a grim resignation. People moved with slow, deliberate economy, conserving every drop of energy as if life itself were a flickering lamp in a gale. The silence was absolute, pressing down upon the survivors, a heavy weight that mirrored the brassy, empty sky above. A single point of movement broke the horizon. Where the land had been frozen in its decay, a man emerged from the wilderness, walking with a steady, rhythmic gait that ignored the oppressive heat. He did not stumble. He did not seek shade. His feet struck the baked earth with a sound that seemed louder than the wind. A layer of red dust coated his frame, matching the very ground he traversed as if he had been forged from the wilderness itself. He moved with the focused intent of a predator or a messenger, his gaze fixed on the distance. As he crossed the threshold of the populated plains, the atmosphere sharpened. The silence of the dying fields seemed to recoil from his approach. He carried no water, no supplies, only the weight of his own resolve. Every stride closed the gap between the desolation and the heart of the kingdom. He reached the paved roads leading to the palace, his sandals marking the stone with sharp, deliberate cracks. He was an anomaly in a land of collapse. A man whose presence signaled that the long, stagnant silence was about to be broken. He did not look back at the ruin he had walked through. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the path ahead, moving toward the seat of power. The palace guards stepped back, their spears wavering, as the figure from the wilderness crossed the threshold. He did not ask for entry. He simply walked into the cool, shadowed air of the royal pavilion, his feet leaving faint, reddish prints on the polished marble floors. The transition from the blinding exterior to the dim, incense-heavy interior did not slow his pace. He moved through the ranks of silent courtiers, his presence acting like a wedge driven into the heart of the court. At the center of the hall, the throne stood elevated, surrounded by the scent of cooling stone and stale luxury. King Ahab watched the approach, his posture stiffening with every step the prophet took. The king's knuckles turned white as he gripped the armrests of his seat, his fingers digging into the wood until the veins stood out against his skin. A tremor started in his hand, a visible shudder that he could not suppress. He sat frozen, his jaw locked, eyes darting to the doors and then back to the man closing the distance. The air in the pavilion grew heavy, thick with the unsaid, as the king realized the authority he held within these walls was suddenly, violently, being outweighed by the silence of the man standing before him. Ahab surged upward, his voice cracking against the vaulted ceiling of the hall. He pointed a shaking finger toward the prophet. "You are the one bringing this ruin upon us," he shouted, his face flushing with a sudden, sharp heat. The accusation hung in the air, desperate and thin. Elijah did not blink. He ignored the guards who shifted their weight, and he did not break his stride until he stood directly before the throne. He stepped into the king's personal space, forcing Ahab to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact. The prophet's gaze locked onto the king, steady and heavy. "The drought is not my doing," Elijah replied, his voice low and vibrating with a power that seemed to drain the remaining warmth from the room. "It is the harvest of your own choices." He gestured toward the icons lining the walls. "You have abandoned the laws of the Lord to bow before Baal, and this silence is the consequence of your betrayal." Ahab opened his mouth to retort, but the words withered in his throat. The king's grip on the armrests loosened as he leaned back, trapped by the weight of the truth Elijah had laid at his feet. The air in the pavilion felt brittle, ready to shatter. Elijah turned his back on the throne. The movement was sudden, deliberate, and final. He walked toward the main archway, his stride long and unhurried, leaving the king to stare at his receding shadow. The silence in the hall stretched, heavy and suffocating, until Elijah stopped at the threshold of the great doors. He did not look back. He raised his voice, a sound that cut through the stagnant air of the palace and echoed against the stone pillars. "Gather all Israel to the slopes of Mount Carmel," he commanded, the words ringing with the weight of an ultimatum. "Bring the 450 prophets of Baal. We shall see whose God holds the power of life and death." The courtiers froze, their eyes darting between the prophet and the king. Elijah pushed the heavy doors outward, the iron hinges groaning in protest. Sunlight flooded the hall, blinding and harsh, silhouetting him against the world outside. He stepped out, leaving the palace behind, his mission now clearly defined. The challenge had been cast, and the path to the mountain was open. Ahab remained motionless on his throne, the command still vibrating in the air like a struck bell, while the guards at the gate lowered their spears as if in sudden, involuntary surrender. The road to Mount Carmel became a river of dust. From the valleys and the scorched coastal plains, thousands of Israelites began the long climb. They moved in silence, a slow, shuffling procession of the desperate. The sun hung overhead, a white-hot weight that bleached the very air, turning the sky into a furnace. Every step kicked up a cloud of grit that coated their skin and parched their throats. Many stopped frequently, leaning on staffs or resting against the jagged limestone of the slopes. Their faces were gaunt, marked by the hollows of 3 years of famine. Children clung to the legs of their parents, their eyes wide and rimmed with fatigue. There was no chatter, no singing, only the rhythmic scrape of sandals against dry earth and the labored sound of thousands of shallow breaths. They were coming to see if the sky would finally break, or if they were walking toward their own end. As the incline grew steeper, the crowd bunched together, a sea of weary bodies pressing toward the summit. They stopped where the plateau widened, their gaze fixed on the horizon, waiting for a sign that the silence of their gods had finally come to an end. The rhythm of the ascent changed abruptly. From the rear of the throng, a surge of movement pushed through the weary masses. 450 men arrived, their progress a calculated display of excess. They moved with an aggressive cadence, their steps synchronized, creating a jarring contrast to the stumbling, hollow-eyed Israelites who parted to let them pass. Every movement was punctuated by the sharp, metallic sound of ornaments striking one another. They occupied the center of the plateau, turning the dusty space into a stage of motion and noise. Their presence demanded attention, pulling the focus of the crowd away from the horizon and toward their display. At the far edge of the gathering, separated by the physical distance of the plateau, stood Elijah. He remained perfectly still, while the others paced and postured. He was a static point in a sea of agitation. He did not look at the newcomers. His hands were clasped behind his back, and his feet were planted firmly into the limestone. He watched the horizon, unswayed by the spectacle that had claimed the attention of thousands. The contrast was absolute, the noise of performance against the silence of conviction. Elijah moved. He stepped onto a flat, elevated rock that overlooked the entire plateau. He did not wave his arms or call for the crowd's favor. He simply planted his feet and waited. The commotion of the prophet slowed, then sputtered, and finally died as his presence began to dominate the space. He looked out across the thousands of faces, scanning the rows of people who had spent years bowing to the unseen. His voice was not a shout, but it carried across the valley with the weight of a stone dropped into deep water. "How long will you limp between two opinions?" The question hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. He did not wait for a response. He looked directly at the people, forcing them to meet his gaze. "If the Lord is God, follow him. If Baal is God, then follow him." The silence that followed was not merely the absence of noise. It was a thick, physical wall of hesitation. No one moved. No one spoke. The prophets stood frozen, their previous arrogance replaced by a sudden, jarring stillness. Across the thousands gathered, eyes shifted toward the ground. The people were trapped in the middle of their own indecision, unable to look away, unable to answer, and unable to move. Elijah broke the tension with a sharp, singular gesture. He turned toward the servants waiting at the base of the rock. His voice echoed clearly across the plateau, stripped of all doubt. "Bring 2 bulls," he commanded. The crowd stirred as the animals were led into the center of the clearing. The dust rose in thin, choking clouds around their hooves. Elijah signaled again. "Prepare the sacrifices. Lay the wood upon the altars, but do not light it." The movement was methodical. Men hauled the timber into place, the wood scraping against the stone with a sound that cut through the remaining murmurs of the people. Elijah walked the perimeter of the area, his gaze fixed on the wood and the bulls. He turned back to the thousands watching from the slopes, his posture rigid and his intent unmistakable. The God who answers by fire, he is the true God. The challenge landed with the weight of an executioner's blade. There was no room for debate, no space for further hesitation. The terms were absolute. The people stood locked in place, watching as the wood was laid out, waiting to see if the sky would offer a sign or remain as empty as the parched earth below. The prophets of Baal claimed the first altar. They began in a tight, disciplined formation, moving in wide, rhythmic circles that kicked up the dust of the mountain. Their chants rose in a steady, monotonous drone, a wall of sound meant to command the heavens. They paced for hours. The sun climbed higher, relentless and white, but the sky above remained a hollow, unyielding blue. By mid-morning, the precision in their movement began to fray. The circles grew tighter than erratic. One prophet stumbled, corrected his footing, and immediately resumed the frantic pace. They were pushing harder now, their voices straining to carry the weight of their demands. The chanting grew louder, shifting from a cohesive hum into a jagged, discordant wall of sound. Every few moments, a prophet would look toward the horizon, eyes scanning for a flicker of light or a shift in the clouds. There was nothing. The heat grew heavier, pressing down on the clearing. The prophets increased their speed, their breaths coming in ragged, audible gasps. The confidence that had defined their initial march was dissolving, replaced by the sharp, visible edges of anxiety. They began to pivot and shout toward the empty sky with renewed desperation, but the silence from above remained absolute. By the high heat of noon, the energy in the clearing had soured into exhaustion. Elijah moved away from the edge of the crowd and found a spot beneath the shade of a twisted, stunted tree. He leaned back against the wood, his arms folded, watching the spectacle with eyes that never blinked. The prophets were drenched in sweat, their movements clumsy and uncoordinated. Elijah let the silence stretch until the chanting faltered. Then he spoke. His voice was not a shout, but it carried across the clearing with a dry, abrasive clarity. "Shout louder," he called out, his tone cutting through the noise. Perhaps he is deep in thought, or maybe he has wandered off to tend to other matters. A few of the prophets stopped mid-stride, their chests heaving, looking toward the tree where Elijah stood. He did not move, his expression remaining neutral, almost bored. "Perhaps he is sleeping," Elijah continued, the sarcasm sharp and deliberate. "He might need a wake-up call." The mocking words hung in the air, heavier than the heat. The prophets glared, their faces twisted with frustration, but their rhythmic momentum was broken. They stood frozen for a beat, caught between the need to continue their ritual and the stinging realization of their own public impotence. The response was immediate and violent. Driven by the sting of the taunts, The prophets abandoned all pretense of prayer. They reached for the short blades at their sides, the metal flashing in the harsh midday sun. There was no hesitation. They began to slash at their own skin, carving deep, jagged lines into their arms and chests. Blood flowed, dark and thick, dripping onto the dry dust of the altar. They moved in a blurred, frantic frenzy, their faces contorted into masks of sheer panic. They screamed, their voices raw and tearing, a cacophony of sound that rose toward the zenith. They threw themselves against the stones, smearing the crimson stains across the wood and the unlit sacrifice. The altar became a slick, glistening sight of carnage. They paced, they lunged, they collapsed, and rose again, fueled by a desperate, failing hope. Yet the sky did not break. The sun remained fixed, a white, uncaring eye in the vast expanse of blue. There was no lightning, there was no smoke, there was no answer. The silence that followed their shrieks was deeper than before, a suffocating weight that pressed down on the mountain. They stood gasping, covered in their own blood, staring upward at the empty, mocking void. The frenzy dissolved into a heavy, dragging silence. The prophets slumped against the stones of their altar, their breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Blood clotted on their skin, turning dark and tacky in the relentless heat. They had nothing left to give, no more prayers to scream, no more flesh to offer. They stared at the horizon with glazed eyes, their shoulders hunched in absolute defeat. The crowd on the slopes shifted. The initial anticipation that had fueled their climb was gone, replaced by a dull, aching confusion. People moved restlessly, shuffling their feet in the dust, their eyes darting between the silent altar and the solitary figure of Elijah standing under the tree. The sun began its slow, inevitable descent toward the west. The light shifted from a harsh, blinding white to a bruised amber glow that stretched long, distorted shadows across the mountain. Every passing minute was a hammer blow against the credibility of the prophets. The sky remained a vast, indifferent void, offering no sign, no thunder, no spark. The air grew stale, thick with the scent of dried blood and parched earth. The ritual was not merely failing, it was dead, and the mountain waited in a state of hollow, suffocating stillness. Elijah stood, his movement cutting through the stagnant air. He stepped toward the center of the clearing, ignoring the broken figures slumped against the blood-stained altar. He walked to the ruins of an ancient site, a pile of scattered, weathered rocks that had long been forgotten. He reached down, his hands firm and calloused, and lifted the first stone. It was heavy, rough with age, but he set it into the earth with a solid, final thud. He moved with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, deliberate and unhurried. He gathered 12 stones in total, one for each tribe of Israel. He placed them in a tight circle, fitting them together until the foundation was level and true. He worked in complete silence, his focus entirely on the placement of the rock. The crowd watched, their movements slowing to a halt as they witnessed the methodical restoration. The tension in the air changed, shifting from the frantic energy of the earlier hours to a sharp, expectant stillness. He brushed the dust from his palms and stood back, surveying the structure. The foundation was set. It was no longer a place of confusion or display, but a platform for a single, focused purpose. He stood amidst the quiet, waiting for the next step. Elijah did not look at the people. He did not look at the king. He knelt at the base of the newly formed stone circle and pressed his palms into the dry, unyielding earth. With a short, heavy blade pulled from his side, he began to trace a deep, jagged line around the foundation. The ground resisted, baked hard by years of sun and lack of rain, but he drove the steel in with rhythmic force. Clump by clump, he pried the earth loose, deepening the furrow until it was wide enough to hold a man's forearm. The sound of stones scraping against the blade was sharp and constant, cutting through the silence of the mountain. He worked his way around the entire perimeter, his breathing steady, never once pausing to wipe the grit from his face. He piled the loosened soil in a neat, raised ridge just beyond the edge of the trench. The physical exertion was immense, yet his movements remained precise, surgical in their intent. When the full circle was finished, he stood and stepped back, his chest rising and falling. The altar sat isolated now, a stone island ringed by a deep, hungry void in the dirt. It was a barrier, a boundary between the common ground and the sacred space he had carved from the dust. Elijah turned his attention to the wood stacked upon the stones. He laid the bull across the pyre, its weight settling with a dull, heavy finality. The crowd pressed closer, their eyes wide, watching the prophet reach for the clay jars placed at the edge of the clearing. These were the last of the stores, kept for the survival of the village, and the sight of them being moved caused a ripple of murmurs to run through the ranks of the people. Elijah gestured to the servants. They lifted the first jar, the liquid sloshing with a hollow, rhythmic sound. He signaled for them to pour. The water cascaded downward, dark and gleaming against the dry, brittle wood. It didn't just dampen the surface. It soaked deep into the grain, turning the straw-like kindling into a sodden, heavy mass. A second jar followed, then a third, and a fourth. The liquid pooled at the bottom of the trench, reflecting the harsh, unforgiving sun. The crowd gasped as the precious resource vanished into the dirt, their faces etched with disbelief. Elijah ignored the growing unease. He watched the water seep into the fibers of the sacrifice, his gaze unmoving. The impossibility of the task was now visible to every soul on the mountain, and for the first time, the murmurs died into absolute, breathless silence. Elijah stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the altar where the first water had already begun to drain into the trench. The wood was no longer dry kindling. It was dark, heavy, and slick with moisture. He turned his eyes toward the servants, his hand extending in a slow, steady gesture. Again, the command was soft, yet it carried across the clearing with the force of a hammer strike. The servants hesitated for only a heartbeat before lifting the next set of heavy clay vessels. They tipped the jars, and a fresh torrent of water cascaded over the sacrifice. It splashed against the stones, hissed into the wood, and flowed down into the base of the foundation. The smell of wet earth and soaked fibers rose into the hot, stagnant air. Every eye in the crowd was locked on the altar, watching as the liquid rendered the fuel completely useless. The wood now glistened with a sheen that denied any possibility of a spark catching hold. It was an act of total defiance against the physics of the desert. The murmurs of the crowd had ceased entirely, replaced by a collective, held breath. The altar was becoming a drowned ruin, a monument to a task that defied all human expectation. Elijah watched the water settle into the deep, saturated layers of the pyre, his expression unchanging, his focus absolute. Elijah did not look away from the altar. The wood was already black with saturation, the bull resting atop it like a weight in a swamp. He stepped forward, his boots crunching against the dry, parched earth, and pointed a single finger at the remaining jars. A third time, he commanded. The servants moved with a sense of urgency, their hands trembling as they lifted the final vessels. They poured. This time, the water did not merely soak the wood. It cascaded in a relentless sheet, flooding the gaps between the stones and gushing over the sides of the foundation. The liquid filled the trench to the brim and began to spill out, carving small, dark rivulets into the surrounding dust. The sacrifice was now a sodden, shivering mess, completely encased in moisture. The smell of wet, heavy organic matter hung thick in the stagnant air. Elijah stood over the ruin, his posture rigid and his breathing shallow. He watched the last of the water settle into the trench, the surface finally stilling. There was no dry spot left, no chance for a spark to find purchase in the soaked fibers. The crowd stood in a state of paralysis, staring at the drowned heap. It was a scene of total, calculated destruction of any natural hope. The tension on the mountain stretched thin, reaching its absolute snapping limit. The sun dipped low, casting long, bruised shadows across the slopes of Carmel. The air, once thick with the frantic shouting of the prophets of Baal, now felt thin and expectant. Elijah did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the king. He kept his focus solely on the ruined altar, where water pooled in the deep trenches he had carved. He stepped forward, his movements unhurried, his boots shifting the loose gravel with a sound that seemed to carry for miles. He raised a hand, and the murmurs of the thousands gathered on the hillside died away instantly. It was not a command born of authority, but of gravity. The silence that followed was total, a weight that pressed against the chest of every observer. He stood centered before the sacrifice, his frame etched against the fading sky. He took a long, measured breath, grounding his feet into the earth. The wind had ceased its restless movement, and even the insects in the dry grass seemed to fall silent. He waited until the quiet was absolute, until the only sound remaining was the distant, rhythmic pulse of the sea. He remained there, a solitary anchor in the vast, waiting expanse, his presence demanding a focus that transcended the hunger and the heat of the day. Elijah began to speak, his voice steady and low, yet it carried across the slopes as if he were standing next to every person in the crowd. He did not raise his arms or pace. He remained fixed, his hands clasped firmly at his waist. "Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel," he began, the words ringing out with a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the very stones of the mountain. He looked toward the heavens, his eyes unblinking against the darkening sky. "Let it be known today that you are God in Israel." He paused, letting the declaration settle over the thousands who watched in frozen stillness. "And let them know that I am your servant, acting only by your word." His tone deepened, shifting from a statement of fact to a direct appeal for the souls of the people. "Answer me, O Lord, answer me, so that this great multitude may know that you are the one turning their hearts back to yourself." The intensity of his focus was a tangible force. He stood motionless, his entire being poured into the petition, his spirit anchored to the altar and the heavens alike. The mountain seemed to hold its collective breath, the air charged with an immense building pressure that signaled the end of the wait. The final syllable of the prayer vanished, yet the silence did not return. Instead, a low-frequency hum began to rise from the earth, vibrating through the souls of the thousands watching from the slopes. It was a subtle thrum at first, a tremor that rattled the loose pebbles near the altar's base. Then, the air itself began to change. It grew dense, heavy, and charged with static that made the fine hairs on the arms of the crowd stand rigid. A sound emerged, sharp and piercing, like the rending of heavy fabric, a dry, metallic shriek of tearing silk that seemed to originate from the zenith of the sky. The horizon tilted. The light vanished. High above, the clouds ripped open, exposing a void of absolute, unyielding depth. From that center, a point of white light bloomed, expanding with terrifying speed. It was not a flicker, but a solid, searing column of brilliance that severed the atmosphere. The air around the altar began to shimmer and warp, unable to contain the heat radiating from the descending force. The hum intensified into a roar that drowned out the wind and the sea. The heavens were no longer empty. They were falling. The descent ended. The fire struck. It did not land. It collided with the earth with the raw, absolute force of a mountain collapsing. A blinding, white-hot flash erupted, obliterating the horizon and turning the afternoon into a searing midday nightmare. The sound was not a roar, but a singular, deafening crack that shattered the stillness of Mount Carmel. It felt like the ground beneath the crowd had been struck by a hammer. Dust and pulverized stone sprayed outward, a blinding cloud of debris that surged into the eyes and lungs of everyone watching. The pressure wave hit the front ranks first, a wall of heat so intense it forced the people backward, stumbling, hands shielding faces from the radiance. The sky seemed to fold in on itself, a tunnel of brilliance connecting the zenith to the altar. There was no room for breath, no room for thought, only the overwhelming, crushing weight of the light. It pinned them to the earth, a force that demanded total submission. Every onlooker froze, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the power. The air smelled of ozone and scorched earth, a sharp, metallic sting that tasted of judgment. The world had gone white. The world had gone silent. The strike was absolute. The white light began to recede, leaving behind a silence that rang in the ears. Where the water had been moments ago, there was nothing but a rapid, rising plume of superheated steam. The fire had not merely boiled the liquid, it had stripped it from existence. The bowl, heavy and sodden with water, vanished in a heartbeat. There was no charring, no slow burning. The mass simply dissolved into the searing current. The wood underneath, soaked through and heavy, suffered the same fate, turning instantly into fine, gray ash that swirled in the violent updraft. The heat was so absolute that even the hard, dense stones of the ancient foundation began to crack and crumble. They did not just break. They turned to dust, their mineral structure failing under the intensity of the divine heat. The trench, once filled with water, stood empty and dry, its edges vitrified into glassy, blackened slag. As the smoke drifted toward the sky, the landscape revealed a perfect, jagged crater. The altar was gone. The sacrifices were gone. The very ground had been scoured clean, leaving only a deep, scorched hollow in the earth. The spot where the covenant had been tested was now an empty, smoking void. The shock held them for a heartbeat, then two. The sheer scale of the erasure left no room for doubt. Thousands of people, who had stood in rigid, divided silence only moments before, began to sway. It started at the front, the closest to the crater. A man dropped to his knees, his hands digging into the dry, cracked earth. Then the woman beside him followed. Then the next. It was a wave of movement, a cascading collapse of humanity as the people of Israel surrendered their resistance. The sound of thousands of bodies hitting the dust was like the shifting of a dune. They did not look up. They pressed their foreheads directly into the scorched ground, their faces buried in the very dirt that had been judged. Silence vanished, replaced by a low, guttural murmur that swelled rapidly into a singular, earth-shaking roar. It was not a plea. It was a declaration. Every voice merged into one, a sound that climbed the mountain slopes and echoed back from the valley floor. The Lord, He is God. The words hit the air with the force of a thunderclap. The division was gone. The limping between opinions had ended. The people of Israel stood, or rather knelt, in absolute, unified recognition. Their voices climbed higher, raw and desperate, finally naming the truth that had been hidden for years. The thunder of their voices died away, leaving a heavy, ringing stillness. Thousands remained pressed against the hot ground, but the aggressive energy of the roar had transformed into something fragile. A woman near the edge of the crater began to sob, her shoulders shaking in rhythm with her jagged breaths. Beside her, a man reached out, his fingers trembling as they brushed the scorched earth near the crater's rim. He did not pull back. He traced the blackened edges of the soil, his face etched with a sudden, painful clarity. The arrogance that had defined their posture for years had dissolved. People stood slowly, their movements stiff and uncoordinated, as if waking from a long, fevered dream. Dust clung to their damp faces, turning into streaks of mud where tears had carved paths. They looked at the empty crater, then at each other, their eyes wide and unblinking. The transition was absolute. The vibrant, hollow vanity of the morning had been incinerated, replaced by a raw, trembling reverence. They were no longer a crowd of divided factions, but a single, humbled body of people witnessing the end of their own rebellion. Every face held the same reflection of the fire that had consumed their doubts, leaving behind a nation finally capable of looking upward. Elijah remained standing, a lone pillar of stillness amidst the sea of prostrate figures. He did not join their weeping. He did not offer words of comfort. His work here was finished, the spiritual drought shattered by the fire that had left only ash and craters. He turned slowly, his boots crunching against the cooling stones that had once held the wood and the offering. There was no victory in his expression, only the heavy, quiet satisfaction of a task executed to the final detail. He walked past the edge of the crater, his path cutting through the crowd without disturbing their stillness. The people were too consumed by their own awakening to notice his movement, but Elijah felt their presence like a fading echo. He reached the perimeter of the clearing and stopped. He looked toward the west, past the slopes of the mountain, toward the vast, empty horizon of the sea. The air felt different now. The heat had lost its sharp, biting edge, replaced by a strange, expectant pressure. He stood for a long moment, breathing in the scent of charred earth and ozone, his eyes locked onto the distant line where the sky met the water. He was waiting for the final sign, the physical proof that the heavens had truly turned. Elijah climbed toward the jagged spine of the mountain, seeking the point where the sky opened widest. He settled onto the rock and lowered his head, pressing his face firmly between his knees. He became a statue of focused intent, motionless and silent. Beside him, his servant stood, eyes scouring the horizon where the Mediterranean met the hazy sky. The first time, the boy looked, scanned the empty blue, and turned back to Elijah. He shook his head. Nothing. Elijah did not look up. He simply signaled for him to return to his post. The second time, the servant's pace was quicker, his anxiety sharpening, yet the result remained the same. Endless, punishing blue. By the third and fourth attempts, the sun began to tilt, casting long, thin shadows across the ridge. Each time the servant returned, his report was a silent, downward tilt of the chin. The fifth time, the servant lingered, his hand shielding his eyes, searching for a phantom. The sixth time, he returned with his shoulders slumped, the weight of the drought pressing down as heavily as it had for years. Elijah remained in his position, his breathing steady, his posture unwavering. The sky offered no mercy, and the horizon remained stubbornly, tauntingly clear. They were trapped in the silence of the waiting, the air growing thick with the strain of their absolute unyielding hope. The seventh time, the servant did not want to look. His legs ached from the climb, and his eyes burned from the relentless glare of the sun reflecting off the water. He hauled himself up to the highest point of the ridge, his breath ragged. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the same empty horizon that had mocked them for 3 years. He blinked, rubbing the grit from his lids, preparing to turn back to the prophet with another silent shake of his head. Then, he froze. He leaned forward, bracing his hands against the rough stone of the cliff face, his gaze locking onto a single point far out over the waves. It was not a shimmer of heat. It was not a trick of the light. A small, dark shape was detaching itself from the horizon. He squinted, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was a cloud. It was no larger than the palm of a man's hand, a tiny smudge of gray against the vast, brassy dome of the sky. He did not move for several seconds, afraid that if he breathed, it might vanish. Then he turned, his voice cracking as he shouted across the ridge. "A cloud! It is small, no larger than a man's hand, but it is rising from the sea." Elijah stood, his joints popping as he rose to his full height. The wind that had been absent for years suddenly whipped his hair and tugged at his frame. He turned to his servant, his voice cutting through the rising gale. "Go! Tell Ahab to hitch his chariot and depart now, for the rain is coming." The prophet stayed on the ridge, watching as the horizon vanished behind a wall of slate gray. Within minutes, the brassy sky bruised into a deep, dark purple. The heat that had baked the mountain for 40 months evaporated, replaced by a sudden, cool pressure. Below, the valley floor darkened as the clouds descended. Then, it happened. A single, heavy drop hit the parched earth, darkening the dust like a coin-sized stain. Another followed, then a dozen, then a rhythmic drumming against the stone. The ground, cracked and thirsty, drank the moisture instantly. The sound swelled into a roar as the heavens opened. The dry riverbeds caught the water, and the brittle straw fields bowed under the weight of the deluge. After 3.5 years of silence, the storm had arrived, washing the dust of the wilderness away in a torrent of life.